Hello and welcome to a new episode, this time with Brian Tokar. Brian is a lecturer at the Rubinstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont. He's an activist and author, a part-time lecturer in environmental programs since 2006, and a long-time faculty member and board member of the Institute for Social Ecology based in Plainfield, Vermont. He was also a founding member and a board member of Vermont's 350.org affiliate, 350 Vermont, and served on that board for more than 10 years. He has contributed to several recent international anthologies, collections, including the Routledge Handbook on Climate Change Movement from 2014, the Handbook of Climate Justice from 2019, and many more. Thank you, dear Brian, that you followed my invitation. I'm very glad and honored that you found the time.
Thank you, Josef. It's great to be here with you today.
Let us begin with a journey to the past. Let us, explore your academic journey and how all began.
Well, I actually started in the world of mainstream science. I was an undergraduate studying physics and biology at MIT back in the 1970s. And went on to do some graduate work in biophysics. But through that entire period, I was very interested in environmental issues, and it was also the heyday of the movement against the war in Vietnam and many other emerging social movements of the late 1960s and early 70s. So from a pretty early age, I was really torn between the world of science and the world of social activism. Around the same time that I started graduate school, I discovered the Institute for Social Ecology here in Vermont, which had been going strong for 2 or 3 years at that time, and started coming up here to Vermont to visit the Institute for a week or two every summer. And within a couple of years, I was starting to feel that the ideas I was engaging with, the things I was reading during those couple of weeks in the summer here in Vermont were more meaningful to me than what I was spending the rest of my time doing. At the time, I was pursuing a PhD in biophysics, working in visual neurophysiology, and it was getting increasingly frustrating, and the work here was increasingly exciting. And it was also the heyday of the direct actions against nuclear power in Germany in the mid-1970s. So I was getting more and more engaged in activism, getting more and more engaged in the ideas of social ecology. And at the point when I had finished my coursework and exams, I took some time off, and over the course of a few months decided to relocate here to Vermont and become completely immersed in the social ecology world.
What does social ecology mean? So the word is referring to two different things, the social dimension and the ecological dimension. So please explain us,
Yes.
What does it mean?
So the key to social ecology is that those two dimensions are fundamentally interconnected, that one cannot speak meaningfully about either without addressing both. And it goes back to the initial work of the social theorist Murray Bookchin, who was one of the founders of the Institute for Social Ecology, his work going back to the early 1960s, at a time when there really was no environmental movement per se, making the argument that the emerging ecological crises that people were experiencing and responding to were a reflection of social conditions, and very specifically an outgrowth of the growth imperatives of capitalism. And that's something that many people, especially on the left of the environmental movement, take for granted today. But back in the early to mid 1960s, there were really very few people saying that. Murray was very much in the forefront, and the opportunity to study with Murray Bookchin in a focused way in the city of Burlington, Vermont, was really one of the things that brought me up here back in those days in the early 1980s. So social ecology has evolved as a very holistic and interdisciplinary outlook. It starts with that fundamental critique of the inherent social roots of environmental problems and political roots, but then evolves toward an anthropological and historical analysis rooted in understanding the origins of social hierarchy and how that shaped the myths of human domination of nature, a philosophical outlook grounded in an evolutionary understanding of dialectics, and a political strategy rooted in decentralism and direct democracy and community empowerment, leading toward a very comprehensive utopian social vision of a world, a human world reharmonized with the rest of nature.
Sounds great. And what motivated you to dig deeper into these issues, into environmental issue, social ecology? What grabbed your attention? What was the first contact? Did you start at the beginning with Murray Bookchin, or did other books inspired you? Yeah, how it began?
Well, I started reading about environmental issues when I was very young, around the time of the first Earth Day in 1970. I was reading Barry Commoner. I was reading a lot of other popular environmental writing of the time. I was introduced to Murray Bookchin's work initially through my experience of coming to university and wanting to be an activist in the early 1970s, in the aftermath of really the dissolution of the New Left and its fragmentation into a broad array of mostly very sectarian and even cult-like groups, and how to come to terms with this landscape led me to Murray's important essay, Listen Marxists, written back in response to the takeover of the Students for a Democratic Society by a Maoist, really cult group in 1968, where I first began to see that it is possible to have a coherent liberatory outlook on the world without becoming a sectarian Marxist-Leninist, which is what we were very much surrounded by on the left in the early 1970s. So it was the combination of Murray's work critiquing sectarian Marxism, and also a very important seminar that I got invited to. I think it might have been my first year at the university, led by Noam Chomsky, who gave a version of his presentation on the diverse varieties of socialism, arguing that there isn't a single political spectrum, but rather there are two orthogonal spectra, where the classical left-right spectrum, viewed mainly in terms of economics, has to be viewed in parallel or in coordination with an equally important spectrum looking at the dimension of authoritarianism versus libertarianism, and that broader outlook on the potential for a libertarian left was also tremendously influential. And now we know, due to much more recent scholarship, that there's a legacy of the libertarian left going back at least 100 years from today's vantage point.
It's very interesting because in America, I see in North America, I see it. It is different than in Europe, especially in Germany and Austria, because here, if you talk about libertarians, you speak about neoliberals. Here, you speak about the far right, and it's the connotation is different. But I have the impression that in America, if you talk about libertarians, then you talk about left wing. Is my first impression, is it correct?
Actually, in some ways, it's almost the opposite. As much as there is a libertarian left tradition, and people going back to the 1950s who called themselves Marxist humanists or libertarian Marxists, the right has completely co-opted the language of libertarianism here as well. We have the writings of Ayn Rand, who of course was a leading ideologue of influential figures in the Republican Party going back 20, 30 years. And they've tried to appropriate the language of libertarianism for the right. And in most US discourse, that same assumption prevails. And to try to recover the historical meaning of libertarianism, of course, Kropotkin in the late 19th century called himself a libertarian communist, and that was common discourse 130 plus years ago, at a time when to call oneself an anarchist just landed you in prison. So people were looking for other language. The work of another anarchist geographer, Elisée Reclus in France around the same time. And it wasn't until the 1960s that people like Ayn Rand tried to appropriate the language of libertarianism for the right, and certainly had a big influence on popular discourse and mainstream journalism and mainstream culture. But there have been currents trying to revive that original meaning ever since. And Murray Bookchin really embraced the language of libertarianism once he was, excuse me, once he was actually invited to address a convention of young right-wing libertarians, and the leadership of that group did not react well to what Murray had to say with his fundamental critique of capitalism. And he came out of that experience saying that if those people, the right-wing libertarians, were at all honest, they would call themselves what they really are, which is propertarians. They view private property as the fundamental social principle, and everything else for them follows from that. It's not about personal liberty. It's really about what somebody owns.
Absolutely. And for example, when I heard the speeches, for example, from Ron Paul, I agree with him on, for example, the US foreign policy, on his peace activism, but I do not agree with his, his tradition, his school of thought, Murray Rothbard and Hayek and the anarcho-capitalist.
Yes, it's really pretty vulgar stuff, and they would do away with all forms of public regulation of economic activity, which would be a nightmare in this day and age.
Absolutely. Let's go back to Murray Bookchin. Who was this thinker and key figure? How could he, be described? Was he a Marxist in the early years? He was a Trotskyist, and then, maybe he turned away from anarchism. But yeah, in the anarchist library here in Vienna, we have still books from him. So he's an anarchist. So how can we understand this figure?
Well, I think your summary was very accurate. Murray really grew up in the communist movement of the 1930s. He was a teenager doing agitation on the streets of New York City throughout that radical period of the 1930s. He split with the Stalinists following the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939 when he was only 18 years old, got expelled, of course, from the Young Communist League, very briefly flirted with Trotskyism, but within a few years became associated with a group of writers and thinkers led by a German exile, actually, named Josef Weber, that published a journal that in English was called Contemporary Issues. It had a different name in German that I'm not remembering right now. But there is some literature online if folks are interested that you can look up and get into some of this history. So Contemporary Issues very quickly diverged from the main currents of the Trotskyist movement and started developing its own very unique outlook that was rooted in the idea, excuse me, in the idea of communities rather than workplaces as the most likely primary locus for radical activity, really redefining the idea of the revolutionary subject as it had evolved through the Marxist tradition from the factory worker, who the Contemporary Issues folks believed were, instead of being disciplined by the factory toward an aspiration toward socialism, that they were being numbed and intellectually hollowed out by the monotonous and often brutal experiences of contemporary factory work. And they started looking to communities and community organizing and people identifying themselves primarily as members of a living community, and that there was much more liberatory potential there than in the conventional workers' movement. And of course, in the 1950s, the labor movement was very much hollowed out by the Red Scare, by the anti-communist craziness that really took all the energy out of many radical movements at the time. People were being blacklisted, people were being jailed, people were being hauled in front of congressional committees to testify about their histories in various communist-affiliated organizations. So in that climate, the labor movement appeared to be almost moribund, certainly any revolutionary potential in the labor movement. And very shortly after that, Murray started investigating some of the environmental problems. He wrote a long article that turned into a pamphlet called The Problem of Chemicals in Food back in 1953, if I recall correctly, starting to make some of the connections that eventually shaped his Social Ecology. By the late 1950s, according to some later interviews, Murray says he became aware that the emerging environmental crisis was much more likely to be a fundamental challenge to capitalism than anything happening of workplaces and economically based concerns. So he began to see a revolutionary potential inherent in environmental thought, and then in 1965 published the famous pamphlet Ecology and Revolutionary Thought, which first articulated the idea that there is something inherently revolutionary about an ecological way of thinking, and that it has both a fundamentally critical dimension and also a reconstructive or liberatory dimension. And that was really the beginning of the literature of social ecology as we know it today. And of course, he went on to write about 20 books and newsletters and pamphlets and polemics of various kinds, and began identifying as an anarchist sometime in the early 1960s through his association with an organization that was actually called the Libertarian Book Club, that was at the time populated mainly by elder veterans of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, from their important agitations in the early 20th century, got introduced to anarchism, identified strongly as an anarchist from I would say, the mid-1960s until the 1990s, when he became increasingly frustrated with contemporary currents in anarchism, the tendency toward lifestyle-oriented radicalism, very depoliticized outlook. You know, in some ways, the height of popularity of anarchist ideas in the US was in the aftermath of the 1999 actions in Seattle that shut down the World Trade Organization. But the style of anarchism that emerged out of that period was very much divided between people who wanted to do continuing street actions, people who were increasingly interested in ideas of direct democracy and how to restructure society, but also a very strong current of anti-organizationalism, hostility to thinking about strategy, in Murray's view, an aversion to engaging with questions of political power, which he saw as crucial. And also, the anarchist press, as it was at the time, was increasingly hostile to Murray's approach, especially his libertarian municipalism, urging people to be engaged in local politics in order to try to transform it, his embrace of the liberatory potential of some technologies in a climate where the prevailing view among some anarchists was hostility to all forms of technology. And those sorts of polemics eventually just wore him down to the point where in the late 1990s, early 2000s, he published an essay called The Communalist Project, which is available online in many places, where he described himself as really splitting from anarchism, no longer identifying with anarchism, seeing it as too entrenched in individualism and a kind of a depoliticized outlook, and began to call himself a communalist, really inspired more than anything else by the legacy of the Paris Commune, which we just celebrated the 150th anniversary of a few years ago.
Absolutely.
So that was his trajectory for most of his life. His active writing life, he identified as an anarchist and was actually quite hostile to the continuing legacy of Marxism. One famous essay was called Marxism as Bourgeois Sociology, which was very biting and was published in a major critical theory journal of the period called Telos, and generated a lot of debate and a lot of controversy. By the end of his life, he, seeing how many on the left, not just anarchists, were wary of engaging with questions of political power in any way, he started urging people to look more closely at the Marxist tradition, and even to study the Russian Revolution and read Lenin and understand in a critical way, of course, what the real roots of those movements were. And certainly his philosophical debt to Marxism was always prevalent. His writing in the 80s was very inspired by the works of Horkheimer and Adorno and others in the Frankfurt School. And certainly the philosophical current of the Marxist tradition going back to Hegel was at the center of his thinking really throughout.
Sounds very deep and yeah, fascinating. I observed the same. I have engaged. I've been engaged in syndicalism, anarcho-syndicalism for many years, and I see it in Bulgaria and also in Austria that the anarchist movement is very fragmented. As you said in the beginning, the left is fragmented, and I see it also in the anarchist movements here.
Yes.
For example, there are social syndicalists, but yeah, 5, 6, 10 people sitting around. So it's always the same. And then there is this Antifa movement, which is
Right.
maybe a strong social movement, but I criticize them because they mainly are focused on fighting, you know, right-wing actors on the street, and they have no theory, and they have no. But anyways, and then there are the lifestyle anarchism, like you said, they have tattoos of anarchism, but they're not politically.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah,
Although there
I
are
can.
some interesting currents in the Antifa circles. There was one group based in Portland, Oregon, which of course has been a center of right-wing agitation in this country for a few years. There was actually a group of young social ecologists that were very engaged in fighting against the fascists, but they also called themselves Demand Utopia. And they did some videos online that were popular for a while, just a few years ago, that actually embraced the philosophical outlook of social ecology very deeply. So there are many currents, and they're all problematic, and many of them are also interesting in various ways. The current movement against the huge police training facility that's being planned on the outskirts of Atlanta, where they would mow down a forested area just outside of the city with a long indigenous history. That movement is very much anarchist inspired, but is also rooted in Black liberation, in creating structures of horizontalism and direct democracy in the movement, and has just and it has a strong utopian dimension as well. So you know, that's the kind of anarchism that many of us continue to have an affinity with, even though most of us in social ecology don't describe ourselves as anarchists per se.
What was his stance, or what was his contribution to the autonomous administration of northern and eastern Syria, so-called Rojava? Was he active involved? Did he ever travel to this place, or did Abdullah Öcalan use the theories and books of Mary Bookchin, or how he came related to this project?
It's more the latter of the two alternatives you described. The movement that the Kurdish movement that we're aware of today really began to take its present form very much in the later years of Bookchin's life. And he received a letter, I can't remember what year, but he was already very much disabled. So it would have been the early to mid 2000s. He passed away in 2006. So I would guess 2 or 3 years before that, but Murray was already quite disabled, and he received a letter from one of the attorneys or translators representing Öcalan, saying that Öcalan, who by that time had already been in prison for 10 years, had been reading Murray's work, was very much inspired by it, and wanted to establish some kind of correspondence. Murray at the time decided that he was not really capable of doing that. So the correspondence never really developed from there. But we know that Kurdish militants, not just in Syria, but around the world, have been reading The Ecology of Freedom and other works of Murray's very closely. There was a student at a university just a few hours drive from here, a Kurdish student who was part of a Kurdish diaspora study group reading The Ecology of Freedom, and got in touch with us just a few years ago. So we know people in that movement are continuing to read Murray's work and continuing to see his political vision as really the precursor of Öcalan's democratic confederalism.
And how do you observe this project? How is it its impact, for example, on also environmental and natural resources issues? Are they implementing the social ecological theories? In your opinion, what do you think?
I think, excuse me, I think to the extent that's possible in the conditions that they're operating under, they are. I mean, they're continuing to be under siege, under attack on a regular basis by forces from Turkey and forces of the Syrian state and continuing remnants of the Islamic State. So they're under siege, they're in a war zone effectively, but given the constraints of I imagine, sometimes overwhelming constraints of that situation, they're implementing what they can in terms of ecological reconstruction, in terms of especially restructuring society around institutions of community empowerment with equal status for men and women, and implementing many of the core political principles, doing it in a way that respects the vast array of cultural and religious differences in the region. They emphasize that it's not exclusively a Kurdish movement, that they embrace the integrity of all of the various cultures that have come together in that part of the world. There's a book that Debbie Bookchin, Murray's daughter, wrote a forward for, that I have a copy of here. It's this book called Make Rojava Green Again by the Internationalist Commune of Rojava, which is a group that was hosting encampments of activists from Europe and other parts of the world to support the Kurdish movement. There's a couple of longer pieces about ecological reconstruction in Rojava that there was one from a German group that Janet Biel, who was Murray's partner for his last 20 years or so, translated into English a few years ago. So there's a fair amount of literature documenting the ways in which the Kurdish-led movement is really trying to implement ideas of ecological as well as social and political reconstruction.
For the exact same reasons, I'm a big fan of this project, Rojava. I see a big potential and progressive ideas and a lot of things. And I wrote also a paper on it. And I interviewed Javor Tarinsky, which drew my attention to your books. Also Anja Flach, who participated in the guerrilla, and Mechthild Exo, a German scholar. So I'm very interested in this field, and I'm curious how it will evolve, and yeah, hopefully the Turkish invasion someday will end, and this project can grow and maybe become an international forefront or example for how how also capitalism can be overcome.
Yeah, and I think it already is in many ways. Many people have been inspired by that movement and have also been drawn to our work in social ecology here in the US, initially from reading about the Kurdish movement.
In my interview with Professor John Holloway, we also talked about an event which should have been in the University of Hamburg, but it was cancelled due to, what was it called, the Verfassungsschutz. It's it's in English like the security for reasons for national securities. They stopped the conference. and John Holloway said it is a scandal, but because this is against free speech and against the academic values that one can discuss theories and books, and so it was funny. It took place, but in a different it happened, but it took place in a different room, and not in the university. So My question is, why do even big universities fear this theory? And maybe because of the history of the PKK, it's in some areas, I believe the EU, European Union, and other nation states put the PKK, for example, on the terrorists list. So explain us, what is your opinion? Why do some actors, politicians, even nation states fear this project?
I think it's very tied up with the current state of geopolitics. Turkey, of course, is trying to play an increasingly influential role in Europe and in world affairs generally, and is putting a lot of pressure on various countries to not have any connections to the Kurdish movement because the Turkish regime certainly views the PKK as a continuing quote unquote terrorist threat. They've continued to do everything they can to suppress Kurdish activism and Kurdish politics in Turkey. There was a political party that I remember correctly was the second biggest party in the Turkish parliament just 4 or 5 years ago, the immediate pre-COVID era, that the Kurds were very influential in, and they were forced out. It was called the HDP, if I remember correctly. So I think it's mostly direct pressure from Turkey is my hunch. I mean, we saw how Turkey tried to hold up the admission of Finland into NATO because of Finland's support for the Kurdish movement. We saw how when Trump was president in the US, Turkey convinced Trump to back off from the support that the US was offering to the Kurdish movement in Syria. I think the extreme overreaction to anything related to the Kurdish movement is very much connected to the current state of Turkish politics and Turkey's influence around the world.
I agree. I agree. I see also that it is also maybe from a theoretical, but maybe also from a practical standpoint, it's a threat to the nation state, to the concept of the nation state, because when we see the history, only the Catalan parliament officially recognized the project and recognized Rojava's administration. And I believe it was just discussed in the Czech Republic, I believe. I'm not sure. I have to check on that. But and that's it. I mean, we have around 190 nation states, and just two are discussing it, and only one. And the Catalan parliament, it's not even a nation state, so it's a region. So inside a nation state. So I believe that you're right. Yes, Turkey is one big factor, but I believe it's also an attack on all nation states because, yeah.
Yes, I think certainly the lack of attention to the Kurdish movement at the national level in most countries is a reflection of how radical that movement is and the threat that it poses long run. I agree with you on that.
When we say radical, we mean egalitarian, because radical in some ears, in some people understand it, oh, they are dangerous. So
yes, of course.
I like to always to clarify this point. Radical means egalitarian and just society.
And it also means getting to the root of problems. You know, it comes from the Latin word radix, is a root. And if a politics that addresses problems systemically rather than superficially, to me is the most radical kind of movement. And for me, it's very much a positive term.
Absolutely. You published a book in 2020 with Tamra Gilbertson on climate justice and community renewal, and there you made a strong argument for grassroots solutions. So
Yes.
maybe before we dig deeper into this book, why is this climate justice movement so important today? Maybe we should even go a step, further and explain, yeah, why are we in this climate crisis? Many are seeing it as the climate that every time, every 10,000 years change, and we have proof that it changed every time, and it's not necessary made by humans and so on. This, and there are a lot of
Sure.
conspiracy theories, and there are on the left, on the right, some, yeah. But most of the scholars agree on that there is a serious problem, that there is a climate crisis. Maybe we begin from here and then we move.
Yeah, and not only that there's a climate crisis, but that the trends that we're seeing in terms of increasingly extreme weather all around the world now cannot possibly be explained any other way than as a result of the excess pollution of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that industrial capitalist society has been spewing into the atmosphere for the last 150 to 200 years. Every other explanation fails to predict the kinds of consequences that we're seeing. And there are very specific studies of the distribution of climate changes geographically, and also in terms of altitude, the different layers of the atmosphere. There are isotopic studies. There are so many. For me, the most compelling argument around the nature of the climate crisis is the convergence of data and of knowledge and understanding from so many different fields of scientific inquiry that converge on the understanding that the problems that we're seeing now are a direct result of industrial pollution and can't be explained any other way. And around 2006, 2007, I became aware of this new discourse around climate justice that was emerging initially from indigenous and other land-based peoples movements around the world, who in many places were already beginning to experience the scale of disruptions that we're only beginning to see in Europe and North America. So the disproportionate impact of the climate situation on people in the global south, especially indigenous people and then other people whose livelihoods depend on the land in tropical and subtropical regions, but also in the Arctic and at this point everywhere else. But we know from various studies that in a few select places in the world, in East Africa, in parts of South Asia, the fingerprint of climate change affecting the weather, affecting people's lives on a daily basis, now we know was discernible as far back as the 1970s. And then by the middle of the first decade of the 2000s, it was enough of a widespread problem in various parts of the world that this idea of climate justice began to emerge, and it emerges a convergence of a number of important currents. The first being the indigenous and land-based peoples movements. The second being the legacy of environmental justice more broadly, which began with people in communities of color, mostly initially in the US, responding to their disproportionate exposure to environmental toxins, movements against toxic waste dumps and extremely hazardous industrial facilities that were disproportionately sited where Black and brown and indigenous folks were living and are living. And then the continuing currents of the global justice, alter globalization movement that came out of the Seattle uprising and other important events of the period immediately before, And the paradigm of climate justice really began in the middle of the first decade of the 2000s to bring those currents together and argue that if we're going to address the climate crisis in a meaningful way, we have to do it systemically. We have to look at the roots of the problem in the patterns of industrialization and the patterns of ownership and the patterns of capital accumulation, and that the climate movement really needs to be an anti-capitalist movement. And for those who aren't ready to take that step, maybe, and that's understandable given the political climate that we're living in today, at the very least, people need to be willing to look at the real sources of the problem, to look at the institutions, to look at the inequalities and who's responsible for emissions. And in the introduction to my book, I cited a whole series of studies, and they continue coming out, documenting that, you know, as much as the UN system has come to some agreement around different countries having differential responsibilities, the inequalities within countries actually represent at least half of the problem. That in the US, I think the latest figure is the richest 1% are responsible for 40 or 50% of the emissions. And we can also look at the particular institutions, the particular corporations that are responsible for the overwhelmingly disproportionate share of climate disrupting emissions. So we need a political analysis in this movement, whatever form that takes, as long as it's systemic and thoughtful and consistent with the reality of what we're experiencing. So those various currents came together under the language of climate justice initially about 15 or more years ago, but it has really just caught on in the last few years, and global networks like the 350.org network have begun to embrace climate justice and have been willing to feature the voices of some of the people and organizations like the Indigenous Environmental Network that have been talking about climate justice now for more than 20 years.
Absolutely. And I always explain that capitalism is based on growth, expansion, and accumulation. And how should it be possible? How could it be possible that we can continue this game in a world that is, you know, has limited resources, and you know, it is clearly in the most easy concept to grasp and to understand that this is not possible.
Very much so.
So Ada,
so my book is a collection of writings from activists from around the world. I'll put it on the screen. This is what it looks like. Climate Justice and Community Renewal. There are chapters reflecting the experiences of people dealing with these issues, both combating various forms of extractivism and climate disruptions per se, and also people working on a variety of local projects aimed at articulating and demonstrating viable alternatives. And the contributors are from many different corners of the world, from India, from Europe, several from Latin America, and the diversity of voices really come together around.
So now you mentioned the concept extractivism. What does that mean for people who are not scholars? And
extractivism is basically the economic dependence on extractive industry, which is a problem in many areas of the world. It became a huge area of debate during the years of the so-called pink tide in Latin America, where many progressive and socialist administrations in South America were also highly dependent on extraction of oil and timber and other natural resources to sustain their economies. They were trying to use the proceeds of those industries to support social progress, to facilitate the development in positive ways of communities that had been marginalized by previous regimes. But the dependence of those economies on resource extraction always became it always became clear that in one way or another that was becoming a problem unto itself.
Absolutely. And it is also
so the debate around extractivism emerged mainly out of that experience, but it's a problem everywhere in the world.
So in simple words, it is the dependency on the world market of for example, natural resources, actors and nation states, for example, from the global south, selling their products on the world market and
extracting resources from the ground and selling them on the world market.
Yes. So, and it has a negative climate impact, and especially indigenous people are moved away from the land, and many other tragic events are happening by doing that process. And we are seeing it also all over the place. Not only in Latin America.
And those of us who have been advocates of renewable energy for a long time, which I have going back to the anti-nuclear movement in the late 1970s, are getting very concerned about the scale of increased mining that appears to be necessary for the kind of renewable energy development that we're seeing today. There are arguments that if we were to really move rapidly toward doing away with fossil fuel extraction, that the amount of mining for lithium and nickel and other materials the renewable energy industry needs would be insignificant in comparison. And I think there's some truth to that. But we know that new mines are being built and proposed again in mostly indigenous territories around the world, including right here in the US.
Absolutely.
So we need to be very careful in our definition of what kind of renewable energy and what kinds of alternatives more broadly are genuinely sustainable and genuinely ethical.
Absolutely, I totally agree. And we also should be critical of this concept of one size fits all, and for example, the global north should be the first who should be addressed, and by abandoning fossil fuels, decarbonization, and then the other stuff. Because I recently read an article from a scholar from the global south that was explaining that, for example, for Africa, decarbonization would be like a genocide. So, so talking about this stuff, we should always be self-reflective and critical, and maybe we should point the finger first on the big corporations, the global north, and then maybe we can expand to other.
Absolutely. Although in places like in many African countries, people are seeing the potential to bypass the era of extreme dependence on fossil fuels and move much more quickly to renewable energy. There are remote places in Africa and South Asia that have never reaped the benefits of the fossil fuel era. And rather than build power lines or transmit or transport quantities of fossil fuels to those places, the answer is in the decentralized potential of solar and wind energy to serve remote places. You know, here in North America and also in Europe, the idea of thorough replacement of the fossil fuel economy by renewable energy depends on things like long distance transmission of electricity. But in a lot of remote areas that don't have electricity at all, solar power can be mobilized much more cheaply than any program of so-called development that would first bring them into the fossil fuel era.
Absolutely.
But I agree with you. The degrowth agenda, which I very much identify with, emphasizes that the high consuming places in the global north are the places that need to degrow our economies and scale back and stop producing the kind of excess, stop proliferating cultures of consumption for the sake of consumption and growth for the sake of growth.
Absolutely. I was noting to myself that in chapter 10 of the same book, Climate Justice and Community Renewal, in chapter 10, you talked about also small is beautiful, and there I wanted to ask you about degrowth, but yes, now that you mentioned it, but I wanted to also point the finger to a paradox, or maybe so that people can differentiate. Because when we are talking about renewable energy, people always, or not always, but often associate the Green Party, especially in Europe. But the Green Party has nothing to do with socialism. In many ways, they are the frontier of neoliberalism. So one has to bear in mind that talking about renewable energy, one can fall easily into a trap, because also China is one of the biggest actor in investing in renewable energy. What does that mean to democracy? Nothing. So just because actors, political parties, or even nation states are investing tons of monies and time and effort in this kind of important thing, you know, it is important, but that has nothing to do with socialism, anti-capitalism, and democracy in the case of China and the Green Party, for example.
Yeah, that's very true. You know, in the early years of the renewable technology movement, there was an understanding that because of the decentralized nature of the technology, that it could develop in a way that was much more, excuse me, that it could develop in a way that was inherently counter to the patterns of capitalism. You know, back in the anti-nuclear movement, we had a slogan that went, nuclear state, police state, that it takes a police state to maintain an energy system based on nuclear power, and that's still true. All the current myths put forward by nuclear proponents notwithstanding, that's what they are, they're myths. But we live in a world dominated by capitalist economies, including China in most respects. And the course of development that renewable energy is taking in the world right now is one of huge mega projects that aren't always consistent with the needs of people and communities and the land that they depend on. So we need to challenge that, just as we challenge the fossil fuel industry, but understanding that time is limited and that we need as rapid a transition away from dependence on fossil fuels as possible. This was confirmed in the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is, of course, a synthesis of the last 6 or 7 years of research in many different fields. We really need to stop burning fossil fuels in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's a tall order given the overwhelming political influence of the fossil fuel industries, as they've been, for most of the last 150 years, the most profitable companies around. And we have to be very careful of the kinds of structures that emerge from capitalism trying to find ways to extract comparable levels of profitability from renewable energy. So we have movements toward community-based solar. We have community-based wind power, although in some ways that's being marginalized by increasingly gigantic scaled wind turbines. I've read about some of the places in Denmark and other European countries that developed a legacy of community-based wind power, but once the industry started transitioning to turbines that produce gigawatts of energy per turbine, and taking advantage of the economy of scale that comes from those gigantic systems, it's become increasingly difficult, even for communities that have been doing this for a couple of decades to continue. So it's a battle over control, and it's a battle for political power, as it's always been in the world of energy and in the world of economics more broadly. So we have to be careful. We have to make a transition. We have to do it quickly, but we also have to be very critical of the tendencies that are pushing that transition toward the status quo, including some of the huge Chinese corporations, many of which, it turns out, were financed with US and European capital at a time when people were looking, and institutions were looking for renewable energy technologies to invest in, and there weren't any in the US and Europe. So these Chinese companies were really the only available investment outlets. So that's one of the main reasons China is so dominant in technologies like solar cell manufacture, battery production, and et cetera.
Absolutely, yes. I also agree that we need a just transition because, yeah, I mean, on the other hand, if it's like some sort of a revolution, it's also fine because, like I see it. Recently I read a statistic that people are flying more than ever. I'm not sure if I got it correct, if I remember it correctly.
Pre-pandemic, that was certainly true, and it's picking up again.
And I wonder if consumption is the key ingredient to capitalism. Maybe it's the opium for the people. and if you take that away. And if you take that away, maybe, they start to reflect, hey, why should I go to work, in this system and work my ass off for what? And now I have to consume. So consumption is a big, factor. And if you take this out of the equation, then capitalism could not function. In my opinion, it's just a hypothesis, but
it's true, and it's why in the period in the 1950s, when capitalism was winding down from the huge expansion of production that happened during World War II, there was a massive sales effort in the US, and I think gradually in Europe as well, because much of Europe was still rebuilding from the war, but quickly caught up. There was a huge sales effort to convince people that the level of consumption they needed to aspire to live a good life was far beyond anything that their parents or grandparents could ever have imagined. And the imposed culture of consumerism is so extreme here in the US. Any personal difficulty or inadequacy somebody might experience, they're constantly being told that the solution is to buy more things, and to buy bigger things and flashier things and more expensive things. And there was a sociological study probably 15 or 20 years ago now, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's even more extreme now, but back then, the average person in the US was basing their aspirations around what level of consumption they should aspire to that of people who made 2 to 3 times their income. And that's all the product of the advertising industry and Hollywood and the culture industry and all the rest here in the US. And of course, it's spread all around the world. Helena Norberg Hodge from the UK has a slideshow she's been traveling around with for many years, showing how symbols of US consumerism appear in the most remote corners of the global South on billboards and T-shirts and signs in, you know, small rural markets. And that's a problem we really need to address on both a political and a cultural level. It's gotten so extreme, and now, you know, that we're finally moving toward electric cars in the US, there's even a backlash against that. People are taught that when they have any kind of problem, that the solution is to buy more things, and it's gotten so extreme. And we even have people saying that electric cars are robbing us of the experience of the wonderful internal combustion engines that we all grew up on. And we need to really get rid of that whole mentality that's so systematically orchestrated by the advertising industry and the culture industry here in the US, and how it's spread around the world.
Absolutely. I wanted to make just a last remark, because you said about the myths of technology, and that you know, the nuclear energy is based also on a technology, and this technology can only be can only evolve in a state, a nation state, and a police state. And the first who really opened my eyes to this myth and deconstructed this myth is Günther Anders. He is also one key figure of the Frankfurt School, but never get famous as Horkheimer and Adorno. But Günther Anders wrote a wonderful book in 1961, I believe. And he dismantled this myth about and the whole narrative about, you know, what is behind this technology, the structures, the hierarchy in the corporations, and it is amazing. This guy and his books. And maybe,
and Murray Bookchin wrote about the social matrix of technology. We need to understand technology not as some kind of autonomous force, but in terms of the social matrix that it emerges out of and that it helps reinforce.
Absolutely. And when we are now critical on technology, maybe we should open up the spectrum so people can understand us better. On the one hand, we have anarcho-primitivism, who is against technology because of the very, you know, aspects that we are talking about. On the other hand, we have this narrative of technological progress, and we should believe in technology and this, you know, fall in love with everything. So we have both ends, and maybe we should, like you said, we should stick with the just transition and evolve slowly, and keep in mind the generations that are following, and the nature especially, and social equality, and many other things.
And also find ways to support those people whose livelihood is dependent on fossil fuel extraction, and find ways to work with them and make sure their needs are met. And that's been at the core of the Just Transition program that you mentioned a while ago.
Dear Brian, I have no further questions. It was an honor, and I enjoyed reading your books, and I appreciate it very much.
And it's been a wonderful conversation. It's great to meet you and great to talk with you, and hope we will again.